Jimin sat at her usual table, her long legs tucked under it, and her eyes fixed on the cup of steaming hot chocolate in front of her. The scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the air, and she couldn't help but feel content as she watched the other patrons of the coffee shop go about their day. Her gaze drifted over to the counter where Jimin, the young barista with piercing eyes and a smile that could light up even the dreariest of winter days, worked tirelessly to keep everyone's drinks flowing. She couldn't help but feel a tingle in her chest whenever he looked her way, and she found herself blushing more often than she'd like to admit. He had no idea who she was, of course. She was just another face in the crowd to him, another customer who came in and out of his life, brief but bright. But to her, he was so much more. He was the reason she always came back to this coffee shop, even though there were others closer to her big mansion. As she sipped her hot chocolate, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to get to know him better, to spend time with him outside of this place. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to their connection than just her infatuation with the charming boy who made her favorite drinks. She imagined them walking hand in hand through the snow, him wearing that adorable red scarf she'd seen him wear on particularly cold days, or maybe even sitting together on the porch of his small cottage, watching the stars twinkle above them on a warm summer night. The thought made her heart skip a beat, and she couldn't help but smile to herself. Yes, she thought, there must be more to it. There just had to be. As Ryan continued to sip her hot chocolate, she felt a pair of piercing eyes meet hers from across the coffee shop. Jimin was standing at the counter, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he quickly averted it and turned away. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and she couldn't help but feel a blush creep up her neck. Was it her imagination? Or did he just look at her like he knew she was thinking about him? She quickly composed herself, taking a deep breath and forcing herself to focus on her surroundings. But no matter where she looked, all she could see was him. The way he moved, the way he smiled, the way he interacted with the other customers. It was as he was a character in a movie and she was the starstruck audience member, unable to tear her eyes away from the screen. Deciding that she couldn't take it anymore, she set her cup down on the table and mustered up the courage to approach him. As she walked over to the counter, her heart pounding in her ears, she rehearsed what she wanted to say hour and hour in her head. When she finally reached him, she took a deep breath and said, "Hi, Jimin." His name rolled off her tongue like honey, and she couldn't help but feel a little more confident. "My name is Ryan. I just wanted to say that I think you're amazing at your job. I mean, you make the best hot chocolate in the world." He looked up at her with those piercing eyes, a surprised look spreading across his face. Really? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm glad you like it. She smiled at him, and for a moment they just stood there, their eyes locked on each other. There was an electricity in the air, a connection that neither of them could deny. Maybe there was more to their story than just her infatuation with the boy behind the counter. Jimin swallowed hard, feeling butterflies take flight in his stomach. I'm glad you like it, he managed to say, his voice still slightly shaky. I love making people happy with my drinks. It's why I do it, you know. He smiled at her, hoping that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. Vine nodded, her own heart racing now. I can tell that you really love it, she said softly. And well, I just wanted to say thank you. You make my day better every time I come in here. She paused, gathering her courage before continuing. I'd love it if you wanted to get to know me better. Maybe we could hang out sometime outside of here? She held her breath, waiting for his response. His eyes widened slightly at her invitation, but he quickly regained his composure. I'd like that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'd really like that. There was a pause, and then he added, but I'm not sure how to do that. I live in a small cottage out in the woods, and it's not exactly the most glamorous of locations. He smiled at her, trying to make light of the situation. Vine smiled back, reaching out to take his hand. I don't care about that, she said softly. I just want to spend time with you. Her fingers intertwined with his, and for a moment they just stood there, their hands clasped together, lost in the moment. I'll find a way to get out there, she promised him. I'll make it work. Jimin's heart skipped a beat as he felt her hand in his. Really? He asked, his voice barely audible. You'd be willing to come all the way out here? He couldn't believe she would want to spend time with him in his little cottage in the middle of nowhere. She squeezed his hand gently and nodded. I would, she said with a soft smile. I really would. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of happiness course through him. Whenever you're ready, she added. I'm here. He couldn't believe this was really happening after years of feeling invisible, of being ignored and dismissed. Someone finally saw him for who he was. And it was this beautiful, kind-hearted girl named Vian. He couldn't wait to introduce her to his world, to share his simple life with her. All right, he said, trying to sound confident despite the butterflies in his stomach. How about tomorrow night? Vine beamed up at him. Tomorrow night works for me, she said. I can't wait. They stood there for a moment longer, lost in each other's eyes, before finally pulling apart. "I'll see you tomorrow then," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Night, Jimin." "Night, Ryan," he replied, watching her walk away before turning back to the counter. His heart was racing, but there was no doubt in his mind that tomorrow night would be the start of something truly special. Excited and nervous all at once, Jimin couldn't help but pace around the small cottage he called home. He had cleaned it top to bottom, making sure everything was just perfect for her arrival. He had even taken a few minutes to practice making her favorite drink just to make sure it would be perfect. Jimin took one last look around the room before sitting down on the couch, waiting for the knock at the door. The moment she arrived, his heart skipped a beat. She looked even more beautiful in person, her long hair flowing down her back, her bright smile lighting up the entire world. "Hi, Ryan," he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "I'm so glad you could make it." She smiled back at him, and he felt himself melting inside. "Thanks for coming," he added, gesturing for her to sit down on the couch beside him. "I hope you don't mind the simple accommodations." "Oh, it's beautiful," she said, looking around at the cozy cottage. "It's so peaceful here." She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the fireplace and the fresh air coming in through the open window. "It's just what I needed." Jimin felt a surge of happiness at her words, and he couldn't help but smile. He poured her a glass of water and handed it to her before asking, "So, do you have any specific plans for tonight?" She laughed, shaking her head. "I don't know. What do you want to do?" She looked at him expectantly, and Jimin felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He had never really thought about what they might do together, but then an idea came to him. "Well," he said, clearing his thought, "I thought we could make s'mores by the fire." He paused, hoping she would like the sound of that. "If you want to, of course." Ryan's eyes lit up at the mention of s'mores, and she nodded eagerly. "That sounds amazing," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I've never made s'mores before." Together they gathered up some marshmallows, chocolate bars, and graham crackers, and Jimin showed her how to make the delicious treat. They laughed and talked as they roasted marshmallows over the fire, sharing stories and getting to know each other better. As they ate their s'mores, Jimin couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment wash over him. He had never felt this happy, this complete before. He glanced over at Ryan, who was lying back on the couch, gazing up at the stars through the open window, and he knew in that moment that he wanted this night to last forever. He hoped that somehow, some way it would. They sat together for hours, lost in conversation and laughter. Jimin told her stories about growing up in the small town, and Ryan shared tales of her adventures traveling the world. As the night wore on, they grew more comfortable with each other, there relaxing into the familiar rhythm of companionship. Jimin found himself staring at Ryan, unable to tear his eyes away from her beautiful face and the way her hair danced in the firelight. He knew he was falling for her, hard and fast. Finally, the fire down and the last of the s'mores was eaten. Jimin stood up, stretching his tired muscles, and offered Ryan his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "Well," he said, trying to sound casual despite the butterflies in his stomach. "It's getting late. Do you want to stay here or..." Ryan smiled up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Or what?" she prompted. Jimin swallowed hard, gathering his courage, and then leaned in his, brushing against hers. She responded eagerly, her hands sliding up into his hair. They deepened, and time seemed to stand still as they lost themselves in each other. When they finally came up for air, they were both flushed and breathless. Jimin couldn't believe this was happening, but he didn't want it to end. "Do you want to?" he started to ask, gesturing toward the bedroom. Ryan nodded, a shy smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Together they walked down the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. As they reached the bedroom door, Jimin turned to face her, taking her hand in his and leading her inside. The rest of the night passed in a blur of soft whispers, gentle and stolen glances. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment their whole life. And now that it was finally here, they didn't want it to end. As the sun began to peek through the curtains, signaling the approach of dawn, spent and satisfied. Jimin wrapped his arms around Ryan, pulling her close, and smiled as he drifted off to sleep, knowing that this was just the beginning of something truly wonderful. When they finally woke up, the sun was streaming through the window, bathing the room in a warm golden light. Ryan stretched lazily, letting out a content yawn as she took in their surroundings. She glanced over at Jimin, who was still asleep, his chest rising and falling slowly with each breath. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of him, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She decided to let him sleep a little longer, instead opting to explore the cabin some more. She wandered into the kitchen where she found a coffee maker and a selection of coffee beans. She grinned to herself as she brewed a pot of coffee and made some breakfast. When the food was ready, she carried it back into the bedroom, setting it on the bedside table. Then she climbed back into bed with Jimin, nuzzling against his neck and letting out a sign of contentment. As Jimin began to stir awake, the delicious scent of coffee and breakfast wafting up from the bedside table, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace and happiness wash over him. He opened his eyes to find Wyan curled up beside him, her hair spilling across his chest. She smiled at him, and he knew in that moment that this was where he was meant to be. Jimin propped himself up on his elbow, taking in Wyan's warm, inviting smile. Morning, he mumbled, still half asleep. He glanced over at the bedside table and saw her phone, which had several missed calls from her dad. "Oh, I didn't realize it was so late. You must have some calls you need to return." Wyan looked down at the phone, feeling a pang of guilt. "Yeah, I guess I should. My dad's been trying to reach me all night." She sighed and sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "I'll call him in a bit. In the meantime, why don't we enjoy our breakfast?" She flashed him a reassuring smile, trying to hide the worry she felt. Jimin nodded, smiling back at her. "Sounds good. I'll go take a quick shower while you eat. We can figure out what to do about your dad after that." He leaned in and her softly before climbing out of bed and heading to the bathroom. As he showered, he couldn't help but feel a sense of elation. This was the first time he had ever been with someone like this, and he wanted it to last forever. He finished quickly, dried off, and put on some clean clothes before rejoining Wyan in the bedroom. She looked up at him as he sat down beside her, and he could see the worry still etching her features. "So," she said, trying to change the subject, "what do you want to do today?" Jimin considered her question for a moment. "Well, I was thinking we could explore the town a bit, maybe find a nice place for lunch or check out the beach. We could also go back to the observatory later tonight, if you'd like." He paused, then added, "Or we could just spend the day here, if you'd rather." He wanted to make sure she felt comfortable, that this was her decision. Wyan smiled at him gratefully. "That sounds perfect," she said. "I'd love to spend the day with you, exploring and getting to know you better. And don't worry about my dad calling. I'll talk to him later today, and everything will be okay." She took his hand in hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "For now, Let's just enjoy our time together. As the sun began to set, Vine returned to her mansion, her heart still full from the day she had spent with Jimin. She was eager to tell her father all about it, but the moment she walked in, she could tell something was wrong. Her father was pacing the living room, his expression dark and angry. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "You've been missing all day, and you haven't answered a single one of my calls." Vine took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, "but I needed some time for myself. I went to visit my friend. His name's Jimin." She hesitated, wondering how to explain the depth of her feelings for him. We spent the day together and I had an amazing time." Her father's eyes narrowed, and his expression turned even more suspicious. "Friend, you say? How old exactly?" he asked, clearly not buying her story. Vine felt herself blushing, her cheeks burning with shame. She couldn't lie to her father, but she also couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth about her feelings for Jimin. "He's older than me, but not by much," she said, hoping this would appease him. "Please, Dad, you don't understand. Jimin and I have a special connection. I need this relationship to be a part of my life." She looked up at her father, her eyes filling with tears. "Please don't take it away from me." Her father sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. He seemed to be wrestling with his emotions before finally turning away, shaking his head. "Fine," he said, his voice resigned. "But you need to be careful, Vine. You don't know this man as well as you think you do." He paused, fixing her with a stern gaze. "And you need to remember who you are and what your place is in this world." Vine nodded, wiping away her tears.